Welcome to the Budo Diary podcast. I'm Przemek Paleczny, a philosopher by training and a long-time martial artist. Here I examine the core concepts of Budo through the lens of philosophy to clarify their meaning and implications. In the previous episode, I argued that self-control is the ability to act without being controlled by our internal states. However, this cannot be a momentary capacity. It must be stable over time. Therefore, self-control alone is not enough. I then argued that there is another element in this system, one that stands in a mutual relationship with control. This element is what we call discipline. I explained that mental and physical strength are alike. We need a minimal level of strength to begin exercising. Then we need discipline to push our limits and develop greater strength. Similarly, we need a minimal level of control to act in a disciplined way. But we also need discipline to build greater self-control and overall mental strength. In this episode, I will focus on this particular element, discipline. There are two ways of understanding discipline that I consider right and wrong. Let's begin with the wrong one. Discipline is often imagined as a kind of prison, as the imposition of external restrictions on oneself. As a result, it is associated with rigidity, force, and even self-punishment. This view is often connected to a goal-oriented approach to self-development. Let's take a simple example. We want to lose weight, and it becomes our goal. We do some research and find a diet to follow. Dietary requirements are external factors. Therefore, we perceive them as imposed restrictions that force us to do what we do not really want to do. This is where discipline comes in. It is understood as forcing ourselves to meet external demands imposed on us. In other words, as doing something against our will. This creates tension, and tension makes us unstable. Eventually, we break. I believe this is what usually happens if this view is maintained. Lasting change requires a different understanding. It is actually relatively easy to force ourselves to do something. It requires only momentary motivation, often triggered by other people's examples. Motivation works like a temporary stimulant. It provides a short-term increase in mental strength, which enhances self-control. However, it quickly fades away. What remains is fatigue, distraction, and stress. Sustaining any activity over the long term does not depend on momentary control that fades like an artificial stimulant. It requires stable control over time, even in the absence of motivation and under emotional pressure. Discipline is not a simple act of control. It is the ability to sustain and repeat control over time, under changing conditions. Motivation eventually fades, while fatigue, distraction, and stress persist. Therefore, something other than motivation is required to keep us on track in the long run. This brings me to the right perspective on discipline. In the episode on Do, I explained how important it is to choose our path, something that the Japanese term Do refers to. As I argued, choosing a path is not simply taking up another activity in our free time. It is not something we do just to pass the time or to gain something from it. In other words, the path must be something that defines us. It must be deeply rooted in our understanding of who we are. Choosing our path has not only deep existential meaning, but also critical significance for discipline. In our example, diets usually do not work because we understand them as something that is not part of who we are. They are seen as externally imposed, like a prison. This creates tension and eventually leads us to break. Moreover, it is much harder to establish any new habit if it is not aligned with our values and our understanding of ourselves. Therefore, the right view of discipline is not that it is an external force imposed on us. On the contrary, true discipline should be rooted in our internal understanding of who we are and who we aspire to be, in accordance with our values. How should this work in practice? Discipline, understood in this way, is not something we impose on ourselves. It is something we construct through understanding and repetition. This process has 3 steps. First, self-understanding. Without self-reflection, we do not know who we are. Instead, we look for ready-made solutions and imitate others. As a result, we adapt structures that do not correspond to our nature. Second, value integration. Suppose you are overweight. It is true that this is unhealthy and that losing weight would be beneficial. However, this should not be treated as an external demand imposed by doctors or social expectations. Instead, it must be integrated into your system of values. Health is not an isolated value. It is connected to others, such as freedom, independence, self-control, mobility, or even aesthetic form. Only when these connections are understood does the demand become internal. Third, path formation. At this point, you no longer follow an external goal. You define a way of being. Your actions are no longer imposed. They express who you are. This is what it means to choose a path. Once this happens, discipline is no longer experienced as restriction. It becomes a natural consequence of who you are. You do not act against yourself, you act in accordance with yourself. This is how discipline becomes the stabilization of control over time. It may seem that discipline limits freedom, but this is only true under a mistaken view. If we treat discipline as a set of external restrictions imposed on us, it does in fact limit our freedom. This is because we begin to act against our will. If, however, we understand discipline as a consequence of our chosen path, it no longer creates a mental prison. We choose who we are and who we want to become. Discipline becomes part of our internalized self-understanding. Consequently, discipline is no longer a restriction. On the contrary, it creates freedom, because it opens space for self-development in accordance with our values and our nature. Let me now connect this with what I argued in the previous episodes. This will allow us to see the structure of this system more clearly. This system consists of 3 elements: Zanshin, self-control, and discipline. Zanshin makes control possible. Discipline makes it stable over time. The foundation of the system is the mind. Zanshin is a state of awareness which, among other things, makes control possible. Together, they define the fundamental psychological attitude of a martial artist, both in the dojo and in life. Self-control is a form of mental discipline, but discipline also plays a broader role in regulating our behavior. Through this regulation, we are able to follow our path. Without Zanshin, there is no control. Without control, there is nothing to stabilize. Without discipline, self-control remains only momentary. Together, these elements form a single system. This is similar to the case of motivational inspiration. It can lead us to act, but it does not sustain action over time. Discipline is the next step. It stabilizes control over time. There is also a reverse relationship between these elements. When we act in a disciplined way, we strengthen our will and self-control. Stronger self-control, in turn, strengthens our awareness, our Zanshin. Let us now look at discipline in martial arts practice. Repetition helps to sustain Zanshin, self-control, and discipline. It creates conditions in which stability can be trained. This is because during repetitive action, the mind does not need to process too many elements at once. In other words, it is not overstimulated. As a result, it becomes easier to focus on what we are doing in the present moment. In proper training, we repeat the same movement again and again, not mechanically, but with awareness. This is Zanshin. At the same time, each repetition is an attempt to maintain control, both mental and physical. It is easier to sustain execution despite distractions when those distractions are limited. This is self-control. Consequently, since discipline is the maintenance of control over time, it is also easier to cultivate disciplined action in such conditions. A disciplined martial artist does not rely on momentary focus. Their control is stable over time. This stability is precisely what martial arts training develops. In sum, repetition creates a kind of laboratory environment in which Zanshin, self-control and discipline can be practiced under reduced distraction. Zanshin creates awareness. Self-control enables proper action. Discipline stabilizes that action over time. Together, they form the core of martial practice. The same structure applies to life. Most people can act with control for a short time. Few can maintain it consistently. Discipline is what transforms intention into sustained action. In this way, discipline enables long-term development. This has been the 10th episode of the Budo Diary podcast. I have argued that understanding discipline as the imposition of external restrictions on ourselves is a mistaken view. It creates tension and ultimately leads to collapse. I proposed an alternative. Discipline can be understood as a consequence of choosing our path. This choice internalizes discipline as part of our self-understanding. It is no longer an external demand. It becomes part of who we are and how we live. I also argued that motivation is external and provides only momentary control. Discipline, by contrast, is the ability to maintain control over time, even in the absence of motivation. This perspective is part of the broader system I have been developing across previous episodes. Zanshin is the state of awareness that makes control possible. Discipline is what enables that control to be sustained over time. At the same time, the relationship also works in the opposite direction. Disciplined behavior strengthens self-control, and stronger self-control strengthens awareness, our Zanshin. Discipline is what turns control into something lasting. In the next episode, I will focus on the primary source of distraction that causes self-control to collapse: emotions. I will also explain how discipline allows us to work with emotions and maintain control despite distraction. Thank you for listening.